Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Mel. How are you?
I'm doing well. I've spent the morning here outside in the sun with some friends. So getting that nature-based loveliness of just being part of nature, being in nature.
You are my role model for interacting with the sun. Because you know how important it is and how everything turns on the rising and falling in the sun. I think people had that, realized that a bit when we had the eclipse last, last week. And the sun went away for a second and then everything stops and changes.
Hmm.
If we're granted all those things that will keep us alive. But yeah,
Absolutely. Funny, last week when I went during the eclipse, I was having dental surgery with a very talented oral surgeon. And he was asking me about my pre-care because he's very interested and he likes to do things that are a little bit, outside of the normal kind of path, but he kind of wants to know what I'm up to. And I explained that I'd spent the preceding 3 hours in the sun getting ready. And he said, "Oh, I guess that can't hurt." And I was like, "No, this is really, really important." So we have this idea that the sun's like an optional extra, where really it's everything for the chemistry of everything that's going on and blood flow and all of those things.
when we move to our next evolution of human life, light is going to be a central part of that.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. So today I was thinking it would be interesting to talk a little bit about acupuncture channels and points, and some of the ways that we get a different perspective when we're looking at the Neijing and some different possible interpretations. Because whether someone who's listening is an acupuncturist or even just a member of the public, people kind of know, like, that's sort of what the deal is that we've got these energy lines on the body and then these points that we put the needles in. Um, but you kind of made some interesting distinctions. So I thought it would be really interesting for us to chat about.
That would be great. I would love to do that. Where would you like to start? I remember when I was thinking about this topic, I was remembering when I was a teenager, like 13 or 14, my parents went to China. It was in the 70s, and they were some of the first people in with a friends group. And they brought me back an acupuncture doll, one of those mannequins. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And there was something about it. There was the suggestion that there was a whole other world of which I wasn't aware that had something to do with the past and tradition, which really called to me and then was really magical. You probably had a similar experience. Do you remember your first experiences with this?
Uh, yes, I'm trying to cast my mind back. I mean, uh, I went for acupuncture before training to be an acupuncture physician, and I think I was attracted to this other world that had a different understanding of how the body worked, but I wanted something quite rigorous, and something that was based in some sort of scientific understanding. But yeah, no, then I kind of dove in from there. But it's been very interesting having trained with this idea of acupuncture channels, which we can't really quite see, but maybe with enough practice, we learn to maybe feel them. And acupuncture points where there's like a couple hundred or a few hundred on the body. But then kind of being introduced to this other way of understanding what they are.
How were they taught to you in your school, the acupuncture channels? What did they say about them?
Let's see. That's a really good question. So there's these different words that get used. So channels or meridians is another one. Some of the meridians are extraordinary. So they're not really even, as obvious as the regular old ones. And it was something that we learned that chi was flowing in them, but even that idea of what chi is wasn't super specific. So it had something to do with energy. For a long time, and I think I've told you this, for a long time, I was very interested in the question of what are the channels in terms of our kind of more gross anatomy and physiology, or because if we're all looking at the same body, then surely there's some sort of correspondence. And so, for a while, I was looking in the literature for that. So some people thought it had to do with the fascia and the fascia networks, and it might be the space between some of those fascial planes. Um, there were some other ideas that I'd come across, and it was at a conference in Germany where I first saw you speak, where someone said, "Oh, you really ought to speak with Ed Neal about this. He's got some really interesting ideas." And he said, I said, "Well, what are those?" And he said, "Well, actually, he believes that it may be the blood vessels and vasculature of the body." And at first, that was kind of having wrestled with this idea for a while. I was like, I don't know, man. That's not, I don't know, poetic enough or something. It just didn't quite immediately grab me. But then when I saw you speak and you describe it, I was like, no, this is really interesting. Actually, this is very beautiful and poetic, but also he makes a very good case for it. So that was the main thing.
And this is also kind of the land of where we prove Chinese medicine. It's where skeptics look and say, you're talking about magic lines and qi, and we don't see anything like that. And we are a thing-based, culture in the West now. So if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And so there's been these attempts to like cut the body open and look at acupuncture points even more closely and see that they have neural plexuses and things like that. And then and it's kind of like that's going to prove that this is all real. So it's kind of been the proving ground for that. And we've kind of come up short on that, I think. You know more about the modern research about that. What has been learned from that?
Yeah. There have been different approaches. So one is looking at like electrical conductance and resistance in the skin. And you can find some patterns there of where there's an acupuncture point mapped that there's going to be a little bit of a different electrical resistance. More on the chemical side, looking at some of the chemical effects of acupuncture needling, there has been shown to be a a delineation where there's a release of ATP, which breaks down into adenosine, which yeah, I think is probably the alpha and omega of the chemistry side of things. And so if you're looking at an acupuncture point, that happens. If you're looking at a non acupuncture point, then that's not going to happen as much. So, but a lot of people, because like you say, people are focused on things, and so they're focusing on what they can dissect and what they can see and what they can hold. And there have been, increasing, good attempts to look at it more from like an electrophysiology perspective. Like we can't see electricity, but we can see that our light turns on, and we can measure electricity, and we know that it exists, and we know that the body runs on electricity. And so maybe it makes more sense to use that lens. So I've seen, um, yeah, better approaches there. There was one pet theory for a long time called, I'm gonna butcher this, so anyone watching this is gonna go, "Oh, she got it wrong." It's like the Jongban ducks or something like this. It was a Korean, researcher who found some sort of like microstructure, that was meant to be the definitive correlate for acupuncture points. But I think that that has also been, not repeated and not corroborated. So people have tried over the years using these different lenses. But one thing that I've discovered from reading a lot of literature is that we have this idea that we try to go into doing research with a fresh mind without, without our assumptions, and try to make it really controlled so that what we're seeing is only the reality. But what becomes increasingly clear the more you read is that it, your worldview is already separating the world into things, and that you've already have a lot of assumptions and biases before you go in. And the kind of crux is that if we want to understand how things work, we need to understand first principles and nature's first principles. And you don't discover those by doing controlled studies. You can discover aspects or examples or pieces, but the first principles themselves don't declare themselves to you through those studies. And you kind of need to know them before you start researching, if you don't want to simply just get kind of this sort of garbage in, garbage out of your assumptions and biases. So I think that's a big thing when approaching trying to look at a human body and try to find the acupuncture points and under a scalpel, is that if you're not understanding how things are working in the first place, then it's pretty easy to kind of come to different conclusions.
It's true. And so we see some paraphenomenon things we notice about things, but not, they don't really give you the sense that's really compelling or that's it. And this is probably one of the first methodological errors we see when people try and study the classics is they take a current mindset and then they overlay it on the other system and say, oh, there they're talking about this thing we know, and there they're talking about this is the lung channel and this is that acupuncture point. And it's really clear that that's not the case, for the classics, that they're talking about, in some ways, a completely different world. I can't say completely, but it feels almost completely different. I think I mentioned that sense of when I first started looking in the Neijing, it was like walking in a cave and seeing all these jars full of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and and it felt like no one had been in here forever, although that's not true. And it just was so interesting. And pretty much early on, I realized that I just had to make a blank slate, try and clear my mind of anything I knew about Chinese medicine, let the words speak for themselves, and not try and make them mean something. And this aspect of the channels was the very first issue, because when you go to look at where the acupuncture channels are described, they come from Ling Shu chapter 10, which is called Jingmai, or the channel rivers. And the first, in the very first paragraphs, they talk about the first upper Taiyin, which is now the lung channel, and the Chinese word Zhufei Shou Taiyin Zhi Mai, which means lung, hand, Taiyin, it's my. That's what it literally means in Chinese. And so there's this issue about this character, my. What does it mean? That's translated by everyone as the lung channel, starts in the middle burner. But that's not what the language says. The first problem is that if you look up the term my in a dictionary, it says blood vessel. And if you go back, from ancient times to modern times, that's what that character means. So is this what I'm reading? Is this what it means? And I assumed I didn't understand something. But more and more, it became very clear that they were talking about topography in a much more nuanced and anatomical way. And and central around this was the idea of rivers. If there was a entry gate to the classic to understand them, it would be blood rivers. If you don't get that, you don't get the rest of the book. It is so central to the book that it's very hard to make sense of anything else unless you get this one thing. But at the time I was reading that, I couldn't help but thinking, I'm just missing something. I'm ignorant. I'm not seeing something that everybody else knows. And so I didn't talk about it for a while. I think maybe I mentioned to you in the last podcast, we were talking about when I first spoke about it. It was at this conference and there was a lot of people there. And I first thought I was going to water things down, and then I said, forget that, just say what you think. And I went out there and I said, the channels are blood vessels, something like that. And I remember coming off a stage and just shaking, and I went into my room like in hiding, because it was like, really felt vulnerable to do that. Now I know that's obviously what it is. Why isn't it seen anymore? That is such an interesting question.
Yeah,
There,
I just wanted to pause there for a moment just to say that what you are saying is different than, the understanding of like 99% of acupuncture or Chinese medicine trained physicians. So it's good to just pause there. Um, and, to continue, why don't they see it? But also to hear not, yeah, some of your rationale, right? Because this is like, okay, it's a different opinion. Let's say it's not right or wrong, but you have, certain rationale to say, look, this is why I'm reading it that way. Do you want to share some of those things?
yeah, absolutely. And, the first thing is to just take the book at face value. So if they say the blood vessel, just say, okay, it's a blood vessel. That's the very first thing. What are they talking about? They have a lot of technical language about the architecture. Um, there's a lot of things. For example, they talk about the idea that the stomach, river, or call it the stomach channel, has a lot of blood in Qi, and another one has less blood in Qi, which makes no sense if you're talking about a line. What are they talking about? If you're talking about a river, it makes total sense. There's so many things. It, there are many things in the Neijing that you are not sure about, or that commentators argue back and forth. That these original descriptions we're talking about blood is not one of those things. It is like, I know it's an opinion, but it's so clear from working in the book. It would be impossible for me to interpret the book or do my work without that understanding. And it's a limiting step if you don't get that, it bars entry into everything else. For example, what is health in the Neijing? It's called being a ping ren, and that's a balanced person. And what's the definition of a ping ren? Ping ren, it says in the text, means no illness. You have no illness. It means that the rivers flow without obstruction. The blood rivers, that they circulate in relationship to the seasons. Every single intervention in the Neijing is aimed at the restoration of vascular blood flow. And so if you don't get this one piece, the whole book is not open to you, and the medicine is not open to you.
So
And
oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
the other really important thing is that one observation, the original channel systems were really talking about the three-dimensional vascular system in a very advanced way. By the way, we have to pause and say this was like 1,000 years, 600 years before what we knew in the West, very detailed. That one observation is the thing that ties Western medicine to medicine from 2,000 years ago exactly and immediately. So, for example, if I'm to go talk to a cancer researcher and they're talking about genetics or something else like that, or cancer tumorigenesis or microenvironment, I'm right there with them talking. I'm coming at it from a nature-based perspective that these are blood rivers and, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a conversation right away. If I show up to them and talk about, well, there's these invisible lines of energy that no one can see, and you just have to believe in it, you know, put on the ruby slippers and tap them 3 times, you know, they're like, okay, yeah, really? What's my next appointment? This is like so important.
Yeah, I
It's,
mean, one really interesting thing that you just said, because in my original training, we didn't read the Neijing. We didn't work with translations of it. I didn't study Chinese, and so I was just basically going on. The textbooks we had were in English, and they were already just presenting the theory. So one of the things that you're sharing is that in the Neijing, it says that these, what are we going to call them? Channels, meridians, blood rivers, these mai, they have blood in them. So, but and it says that repeatedly, right? So then it becomes a question that if you want to, if you're wondering if you can use the argument that these are invisible energy lines, then to try to make sense of those invisible energy lines having blood in them, then it becomes a little bit tricky. Like then it needs to be somehow some sort of metaphorical thing or a
it,
metaphysical thing, or it becomes
yeah, it falls apart immediately.
more tricky, and I wanted to say that because I think, I everyone who people who've trained have all different backgrounds in terms of training. Some schools are more focused on the classics, some less so, but probably, I know in China, studying the classics is falling out of favor increasingly. So, even amongst trained acupuncturists, the knowledge that it says that in there repeatedly might be new information that that these might have blood in them, and so, just to kind of pause and say it's interesting that this new interpretation, if we understand that the text says that over and over again, maybe sheds a little light that they're a little bit different than what we,
I mean,
understood them to be.
we could easily spend a whole hour for me going over all the text instances that show you why this is true, but it's easier just to say, like, this is a point of view, that makes the text makes sense, not only to us, but in terms of nature, in terms of medicine, in terms of modern science. It's really like if you don't get that one thing, you're not going to see this world in a certain way. So it's really critical. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was another excellent point because the other corollary of this conversation, that the basics of acupuncture, as we most people know and love it, is that we have these invisible energy lines and we have these acupuncture points.
Right.
So the other aspect of this is that then we use the little needles to to insert and influence these acupuncture points. And you brought in a really interesting point from the different types of needles that they describe in the Neijing. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So if you, this is something where the practice seemed to change in its trajectory away from a river-based system to an acupuncture point and channel line system, and it happened somewhere around the Han Dynasty. We don't know all of the ins and outs of that, but by the 10th century, it really was focused when we had the bronze man and you were trying to find the point, and that's how you passed your exam and so forth. And then it evolved into modern times where the point is pretty much like a medication, like this one's good for headache and this one's good for irritable bowel syndrome. And you put them together protocols and things like that. That's a very different idea than what the original vision was. And we can see that in the description of the tools and the technique. So there was something called the 9 ancient needles, and they were really an ancient surgery set to regulate blood flow, to be irrigating surgery in a certain way. And if we look at the techniques that are discussed in the Ling Shu, which there are 26 main ones, the interesting thing is that they don't talk about points. They talk about points, and they talk about, if you want to affect the organ, use the Banshu point, and the same with the Fu organ. Everything else, no points. What are they? They're descriptions about tissue surgery and pathogens and things that obstruct the watersheds that rivers flow through. We work on usually the land around rivers in Neijing ecological surgery. We don't stick the needle in the river itself. We're working on the riverbed. So they're saying if you have a problem in a sinew and it's near the bone, here's the treatment, here's the tool. If it's in the body, here's the treatment, here's the tool. If it's in the skin, here's the treatment, here's the tool. So it was very much a form of ecological surgery whose goal was to restore the blood of the body. Why was the blood so important? We can ask that too, for a variety of reasons. It emanates from the heart. The Mai emanate from the heart. And they carry the nourishment all around, but they also carry this other important thing, which is light and Ming, which originates in the heart and it flows through the vascular rivers. And so when we're working on the tissue bed, we're trying to restore flow to blood to the tissue beds, not only for nourishment and circulation, but organization and biological coherence. So this whole system is based on blood, and really you don't get anywhere near it without that understanding. I remember, I'm trying to remember the progression of how I came to understand that. And it's not so straightforward to just say that this is all about blood vessels, because it is actually more nuanced and more sophisticated. For example, they have terms such as Jing and Lo. Jing, Lo, and Mai are the three terms that we use to describe the system. And Jing and Lo are what we call graining patterns. And graining patterns mean places where there are spaces in tissue where things can flow. And Jing patterns run vertically up and down, and Lo patterns move out to the side. And some of those Jing and Lo patterns have blood in them and some don't. And when they have blood in them, they're called Jing Mai or Lu Mai. It's very straightforward. And so there is a hierarchy and an understanding of how the body's formed around graining patterns, which is beautiful and sophisticated. And that's the basis of our anatomical understanding.
Can you give some examples of where we might see some of these grading patterns just sort of in our day-to-day life, because I think that that can really bring things alive.
Well, in trees, you could see them in trees for sure. You know, there if you cut a tree open and you see the xylem and the phloem, the fluid pathways, there's ones that go up and down, and they correspond to yin and yang pathways of circulation in the body. And there's branches that come off of the tree and branch out, and those are called low pattern. So basically, it's patterns of how yin and yang move into the world of nature in living form. So in a tree, for example, you'll see it growing axially back towards the sun. That's a Jing pattern. And the metaphor here is of a loom. The nature has a loom and it weaves itself. It weaves its world on this loom so that the vertical threads, the warp threads, are the Jing patterns, and they create the structure and the orientation. And then the weft threads, the threads that give a carpeted texture and beauty, come out to the side, and those are called low patterns. The Jing patterns are yang in nature, and the low patterns are yin in nature. So the body itself is made of a combination of these, we call them axial and radial patterns, things that go up and down and things that go out to the side. And they're not just a bunch of lines because it's a combination. So there's variation in work, but the general theme is up and down. For example, if you look at the lower Yangming channel, which is actually called the lower Yangming River, it starts up near the nose. It runs down into your face, up on your forehead. It becomes the carotid artery, and then it moves into the chest. It runs down where the kidney channel is now, feeds the breast. It has an internal course. They meet at the groin. It becomes the femoral artery. It goes down through the leg and through the knee. It becomes the anterior tibial artery and so forth. So that whole vascular system was seen to be one vertical river, and that river goes through Western counterparts. So there, those arteries I was talking about are there. But it was seen to be one river system from head to toe running in a vertical line. So we would say it's a Jing pattern. From that pattern, things are going out to the periphery, like collateral beds, the things under your skin and so forth. Those are the collateral beds that move out to the side. So that's a grading pattern that does have blood in it, and so it's called a Jing Mai, that vertical line. That vertical line, by the way, defines what we call in nature-based medicine a watershed. And a watershed in nature is an ecological terrain, a place with its own weather, its own plant life, its own animal systems, that's defined primarily by the course of a main river. And so when we talk about the lower Yangming River going from head to toe, covering all that terrain, it's also associated with ecology around it, like the sinew system and the skin system, but it's all defined by that main river. And that's where we kind of focus our diagnostic. Was that too confusing or geeky?
I mean, not for me, but a beautiful explanation. It's funny. You started off by saying that the Western mind likes to live in the land of things, and I think that when I first was introduced to this idea, uh, in your theory, without hearing you describe it and knowing that you had a medical background, I thought that you were trying to overthingify.
It's the Western doctor trying to take over our medicine. Yeah.
Well, a little bit. It was because it was so concrete. But now I know, and after listening to you describe it both in connection with the original text and then also with your patients, which is really kind of where the rubber meets the road anyways, that we can sit and talk about these ideas for years, but ultimately does it benefit patients and it affect how we treat when we see things that way. And I realized that actually, it is all about tying things back to nature and how they work there, and that these are the first principles and they're always true, and that's how things run. I love as well with these ideas because I have a 5-year-old daughter that but all these things make perfect sense to her, so we were just looking at a turkey feather this morning, and you see the Jing-Lo patterns everywhere, and,
You get the patterns, you see them everywhere,
mhm.
not these hidden lines. It's like, oh my, like, oh, it kind of hits you like, oh my God. It also changes, it might be interesting to talk about how it changes practice. I remember before, I loved Chinese medicine before, but I remember a lot of it for me happened in a thought bubble, which is there's kind of a thought bubble over my head. And it's like, oh, it's a wiry pulse. It's the tongue looks like this. Here's the symptoms. It's all going in my thought bubble. The protocol is this, and the formula is that, you know? And so I do all those things, but I'm kind of living in a thought bubble every day. And then I don't see the results. I remember when I started out, I would do things and then I would kind of make a Hail Mary prayer, like, God, I hope this works. I had no idea. And then when the person came back and said, well, that worked, I was like, seriously? Over time I got used to that, but it was like living in a thought bubble. When you see the body as nature, which of course it is, I mean, becomes obvious if you think about it for more than a little while, then every person that comes in is a unique example of the universe creating itself upon its original design, formed around a state of light and with natural expression. And so it's this thing of immense beauty. One of the things we do in clinic is help patients remember themselves. And what does that mean? That your child, for example, knows that. Children know that. They know what they have is something special. And then usually when they get older, they get talked out of it. You're just a person. You need to get a job, like you're no better than anybody else, whatever it is. And we become this cog in the machinery of life, you know? And so whenever I work with a person, the first thing I try and remember is this is the universe recreating itself in a sacred way. I'm never going to see this example again, only here once in the universe, right now in front of me. It's breath of life forming around a state of light, creating nature just like the natural world creates itself. And it's breathing and moving, and rivers are flowing through it. And I have the privilege of stepping into work. And then what I'm doing is ecological restoration. So say there's a Yang problem. What am I going to do? Not a protocol. I'm going to what we call run the river, which means I'm going to start at its headwater and I'm going to start to move down it and feel it and feel the tissue planes and how it's working and how it's not, all the way down to the end. And then I'm going to make an ecological diagnosis. What's wrong? And we do this by asking the primary question. We call it the primary question, which is what does healing look like for this person now? Or we can say, what does healing look like for this watershed now? How would we restore it to beauty? I mean, that is like so much more interesting. Plus, when you see things out of balance and you restore blood flow, that you open up a path above and the river flows down below and all the color returns, you're watching the body heal itself in real time. So it's not a thought bubble, hope to God they get better. It's like they should be better and you should see them being better before they leave the clinic that day. And if they're not better, you need to try something else. You need to get this result. And just in terms of the enjoyment of work and the beauty of it, and by the way, here's a little trick, which I don't ever usually promote, but when you restore ecology, illnesses vanish. I mean, not all of them all the time. They're not always easy. We don't always succeed with everything. But oh my gosh, when you restore ecology, which is what is the body is thirsting for, illnesses just seem to evaporate, in many cases. So we don't even talk about that, you know. It's kind of amazing. And there's this way of that it restores faith. To me, when I see the body recreating itself, and I see some pretty sick people. I mean, my practice is like you're on death's doorstep usually. And I see them time after time, like, oh, I can't believe that got better. And it's because when ecology comes back, you're better. It's kind of amazing. I don't want to oversell that because then you sound like those people. but it is.
This is one of the challenges if you're doing what you're doing, it's challenging, to talk about it for the reasons that you're alluding to.
And we're at this stage also where this is new. We have this thing called nature-based medicine, which is based on 20 years of Neijing text work and making a healthcare system around that. But we're at the stage now where we need to go out and treat a lot of people and have people examine it and see whether it's true and where it is true and where it's not true, and not just be dreamers about it. But it's kind of miraculous, I have to say. And it's, for example, it's given rise to whole new models of, for example, cancer care, where we have an approach now with cancer that our goal is not to limit blood flow, but to restore healthy blood flow to tumors.
Mm.
And do that, they seem to remake themselves upon the design of their original tissue plan.
Which but, when you, describe that, because that's so counter to the, aims of the industrialized approach to cancer care, but that, from my perspective, is 100% consistent with an understanding of cancer according to the cell danger response, developed by Bob Navio. So, what you describe in terms of, cancer being tissue that's kind of like a lost child, that lost, the coherent template of what it should be doing is 100% consistent with, in terms of, the cell danger response, which is mainly a cellular model, is that cancer is the second step of cellular healing. So in the first step, there's a stressor, or an infection that the cell and the tissue needs to fight off. In the second step, we're basically replacing lost biomass. So if your liver got damaged, now it's going to regrow some liver. And then at a certain point, once things are the right size again, then they need to go into the third step, which is now they need to be rejoined to the network. So the cancerous tissue is very much one's own tissue. It's not some foreign thing that's out to get you, but it's one's own tissue that's in the cell cycle trying to grow to it's running a program, which is the same program as when we started off small and became big. And it's running a program to replace tissue, and then it needs to then pick up the marching orders from the rest of the body and, start, in terms of coherence, like these involve, calcium waves that are going in a particular frequency that let the tissue know that it's part of a particular organ and then it needs to rejoin the network. So it's definitely consistent with, I would say, with kind of the more up-to-date models that are coming from a more biochemical and metabolomics perspective.
Yeah, it's in traditional language, we'd say very similar thing. And we might say that the universe is motion, it's breath that moves in and out of form. And by the way, form is the minority of things in the universe. We know that even from a modern scientific point of view, the baryonic world, or the thing of atoms, it's only 4% of the universe. Everything else is invisible motion. And the Neijing says exactly the same. This is about motion, people. Occasionally it turns into a thing, we call that form, but that's also in motion too. And life itself is a form of coherence, not structure. It's like all these things are in you and they're breathing and they're coherent, meaning that they attend to the home issue, like you, etc. And how does a liver cell know how to function exactly as opposed to its next liver cell? And it does that because in three-dimensional space, there's a coherence of breath, media, and it runs back to the heart, where the central organizing pattern is in the traditional medicine. And in cancer, and so it's breathing. And breath, by the way, means in Chinese thinking, motion is not just motion, like kicking a ball. Every time something moves, it transforms. So it changes too. There's that aspect of motion. And so things are constantly breathing, moving, changing, and transforming, which, if they're in a healthy system, have a coherence around the center. And when the vascular system or the tissue planes go offline, and that coherence is lost, the tissue is still breathing and trying to change and transform, but it has no organizational language. So it looks like a tumor. It's like a mushroom or something. It's just like growing off in weird ways. And the organizing coherent in the traditional language is in the light. It comes from the heart that flows through the blood. And when we restore the blood, it goes, oh yeah, I'm a liver cell. I think maybe I mentioned this, but this was, by the way, very nerve-wracking for me because in the beginning, because I would see people who were very ill, multiple cancers, on hospice care, 6 weeks to live. Can you do anything? And cancers that look pretty mean, ugly. And you didn't want to give them any fuel at all, right? Because that would have been the end. And I remember the first few times so cautiously, so carefully, and explaining to people like, we don't know, but there's nothing else to do. Let's try it. And I remember the first times of promoting blood flow to one of those areas. Wow, was that nerve? That got me a little nervous. And then what I saw was everything got better. And I would see tumors reforming themselves into the architecture. This is really interesting. Like when you have surgery, how does your body put itself back together in order? That goes back to this idea of coherence. And I saw the tissue going back to not just that the tumor was going away, it was going back into what it looked like before. And I remember, maybe I mentioned this, but I called my friend up who's an oncologist in San Diego. I said, what's going on with the genetics and the biochemistry when tumors go back to normal tissue? And he says, that never happened. And that's kind of when I got chills and I realized, whoa, there's a lot here that we have in our tradition that can be used in Western medicine.
But one thing that I think helpful to pause on there as well is that in industrial medicine and Western science, there's been a huge focus on genetics in terms of oncology, and that focus with the war on cancer and trillions of dollars spent since the 1970s has not borne fruit in many ways. And one thing that's really interesting here is that, just to pause, when scientists undertook and succeeded in the Human Genome Project, at that time they believed that once we had the full genetic sequence of the human genome, that would be the end of illness, that we would know everything that we needed to know, and then that would be done. And what many people kind of, it was tough to pause and think, is that the DNA, the genetic code, does not contain information about three-dimensional structure.
Right.
So a lot of people are aware that every one of your cells has the same genetic code. So your liver cell and your eye cell and your hair cell and your skin cell, they all have the same, I would say, like, book of information. They may be opened to different pages and expressing these different, chemicals and proteins and making different things. But they're in that code, there is not a, this way is up, this way is down. This is how big your liver should be. This is the size it should be on. That information's not in there. And that's, to me, not a small detail in terms of how to make a human. So if you have a story of how to make a human and you talk about, well, you have a fertilized egg and then it divides and divides and divides and it has these 23 chromosomes and voila, but you missed the part of like how to organize it in three-dimensional space. And we haven't even, gotten to anything particularly esoteric here. We're just still talking form and structure. That's not a small detail to be missing. And it's really, I'm hearing, and my understanding as well is that this is fairly central in part to the cancer story as well.
It's huge. That's the $1,000,000 question. And it's interesting when you look at modern medicine, it's doing so well in so many ways. We do know so many amazing things. And we get the sense that we kind of know most things, but if you want to advance medicine, one way is like to be in the current story and make a better chemotherapy drug that's more effective, less side effect. That's fine. But if you really want to change medicine, look at this story as a whole and see where are the big issues that we're not even talking about. And three-dimensional structure is one. So right now there is no language that Western medicine has about how the body organizes itself in three-dimensional space. It's not just that the cell knows how to become a liver cell, and by the way, that cell has a different job from the one next to it. It's slightly different, right? So all these cells are working together. That's the question. How do they do that? And it's not only that they do that, but that they can do it in changing environment. So when I get sick, all the requirements change. And when I go to Italy and eat different food, everything changes. And when I get older, everything changes. When I'm young, it's one way. When climate change changes, it changes all those things too. And so the body has to not only know what to become, but how to constantly change itself to keep this coherence we call life together. Um, and that happens through three-dimensional structure, most likely. And what does that mean? We call that a biotensegrity. It means that if you look at the connective tissue, which we think of as our muscles and our fascia, which is called sinews in the Neijing, there's also a micro connective tissue environment. There's microtubules in the cell, and there's cellular cytoskeleton, and they're all connected with their embedded matrices that they're in. And all of those things connect to each other, and they're moving around, constantly adjusting. I have this ball on my desk that you won't be able to see in the audio part, but it's like this, it's like a ball that's breathing and it's all connected. You can see them in the Buckminster Fuller domes and things like that. And a biotensegrity means it's all connected. And if you poke on one, an impulse goes into that system and changes everything. And that system can reorient itself around the center, which is in the Neijing, the heart. And so that's how cell number 371 in the liver knows exactly what to do, because all the way from the macro connective tissue down into the inside of the nucleus of the cell, there's a network that goes all the way in there. And so when you torque your shoulder, for example, it actually puts the stress into that biotensegrity that goes all the way into the cellular nucleus and changes how DNA is transcribed, which is amazing. But in Western medicine, we have no language for that. For example, if you come, and this is where Neijing medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, we got the goods. And this is one of the places we can really help Western medicine right now. So if you get cancer, for example, we can tell you all sorts of things about that cancer. Say you get lung cancer. Well, there are risk factors. Maybe you had those. There's genetic predilections. Maybe you had those. But why did that cancer come in the left middle lobe on Tuesday, April 13th? We don't really know. Why wasn't it on the other side? You know, and we can do things to the thing that came. We can cut it out. We can radiate it, but we can't change the original landscape that made it, because we have no language for three-dimensional architecture. We do have ideas like the ecological model of cancer. That's an idea, that cancer is like a weed. Some people say that, and it's the environment that creates it, not the weed itself. But they can't tell you the technical aspect. Why did the weed grow there? What was wrong? The Neijing language, the medicine built around a blood-based system, is the stuff that tells you why this came where and what you're going to do about it. And that's like magic in a certain way. So there are no magical channels, but there is magic in a certain way. The body heals itself. And that's why we say the impulse of the universe is towards healing. Like if you get out of its way, it will heal. It's when it's stuck that it can't do that. And that's where we step in with this ecological surgery.
Phenomenal. It's that's really, really interesting. And I think can seem I think it's so far beyond what most of us are used to in terms of understanding what's possible. But yet when you kind of see it enough time.
One thing that is so striking is the anatomy they describe. I mean, you studied with us. People have no idea about the extent of the anatomy and how precise it was and how far ahead of its time it was. It's not easy to cut people open and see these, like when you say the Li which is called lung 7 now, which is called a low point. That's a whole other topic. And it's kind of a mistranslation of a term. But originally it described what we call a distributary, which is a river that took off from the main Upper Taiyuan Lung River. And it says it breaks off from the main river, and then it makes this kind of circle in the palm, and it goes off into the fish border. When you look at the Western anatomy of the palmar arch, it's exactly that. But you don't see that when you take a knife and cut open a corpse, you know? And it's like, it's mind boggling how advanced it was. And this is not known by people in our field. Like I say, studying this is almost as much as studying Western surgery because the anatomy's there, the science is there, the techniques are there. And when you restore and by the way, our approach to illness, it's a kind of a secret, but we only do one thing. We do the same thing over and over. No matter what your illness is, we say, what's the landscape? What's the ecology? How are the rivers flowing? And let's make it right. And when we do that, as I say, illness, that's the prerequisite for an illness to be there. So if we can restore that, then the illness, we can't always do that. Sometimes we're not good enough. We don't see it. The person misses their appointment, whatever. There are people we don't cure everything, of course. But when we do get it right, the prerequisite for the illness is not there and it tends to just go away.
It's so interesting because when I was studying, what I was taught and what I heard everywhere was that the authors of the Neijing, and it's a compilation, isn't it? And it was put together by various authors over time. But at that time, the story that I heard repeated was that they never looked inside of a body because it was against their beliefs and religion. So therefore, they, they didn't know what was in there, but they just saw these energy lines, but what you're describing, suggests that maybe they had seen inside of the body.
Oh, I mean, they clearly did that. I mean, number one, no matter what the laws are, doctors of all time get bodies in the middle of the night and cut them open. I mean, it's just like what they do. They're not going to sit around and not do that. They have to learn and do that. So that happens all the time. Number two, in the Neijing, they say they did that. They said the body can be known by cutting it open, you know? And number three, the descriptions are so accurate. They might have done other things like you can take a straw and run it through a blood vessel and see where it goes. But like in terms of the palmar arch, those vessels are so small. Wow. I'm not exactly sure how they did it all because it is mind blowing. We didn't even know that the heart circulated the blood until the 1600s. It was so far ahead of us. Sometimes we joke like, the Neijing came from a spaceship and that people came by and dropped off the text and then left, because it's so far advanced. And it's beautiful. Also, I would say this, we didn't get time to talk about the points today. Maybe we should have a part two on this. I don't know. We can think
That
about.
sounds good. I think these ideas are, they're many things. They are beautiful and they're powerful, but I think, depending on whoever's listening, their point of entry into this wider topic is that they are very different from what's normally thought about these things. And yet there's a lot of richness and a lot of depth and a lot of support that once you start to question, with any idea, if you pick it up and hold it and turn it around and question it, and, does it make sense from these different angles? Is there a rationale? And is it helpful? I was with models, it's like, okay, is it true, but is it useful? And it really does pass all of these tests. So very interesting. Yes. And I think points is a whole another big topic.
Right. And I remember, and there's a reassuring quality when like we call this nature-based medicine, and is the fact that everything and an aspect of nature, and we come to see ourselves separate, and that's just a kind of a mass hallucination. Doesn't have much to do with reality, of course. I remember when I was translating these things, and you can always translate them a variety of ways, and I would look out my window, and one of my main books translating was a plant physiology book. And like one of my criteria in text archaeology, which is this formal approach to translation, one of the criteria is, do you see it in nature? And if I can't see it in my garden, I'm pretty suspicious. If it doesn't correlate, with things in nature and what scientists know about nature, then I'm probably on the wrong track because these people who wrote the Neijing, they weren't making stuff up. They were carefully examining patterns of plant and sun and clouds and weather. They were scientists just like we are, and they were putting them down, their ideas and theories, and writing them down. And then they said, this is so important. We need to put it in a text, and that has to be handed down to the later generations, which is us, so that it doesn't get lost because it's so important. Um, and there's this way also that we're in this time right now where we don't know what to believe in, and everything is very chaotic, and it causes anxiety. And the idea again is erase the board, start over with nature. The sun rises in the east; it sets in the west. Nature opens and closes. It opens in the summer, it closes in the autumn and the winter. These very basic things upon which Neijing medicine and Chinese medicine is based, because Neijing is the source of Chinese medicine. Um, then there's this deep kind of relaxation, like, yes, I can get with this. By the way, patients too.
Yes.
Like when I see a patient and I give them the Western medical explanation, there's cytokines and this, that, and the other thing, they kind of go, okay, if you say so. But when I say your body is made up of breath, it's like nature, and here's a river. Can you feel the river? And it's hot up here and cold down here. And I'm going to put the needle in here and irrigate it and restore the flow, and the heat comes back. They go, wow, yeah, right. I get it.
Very cool. Very cool.
This information is mind blowing, beautiful, dense, disruptive, all sorts of things all at once. And, I've come to learn teaching it. You have to teach it in a certain way because we can talk about some things in a podcast, for example. Then there's things I call long learning things that you have to think about again and again and again and again. And
What
slowly,
about your single point headache protocol? No?
sure. Yeah. Just find a place that's holding the headache in place and release it.
Yeah.
We're going to be different, everyone.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. But I think and it also, there's these bigger overarching themes like, what did we do with traditional knowledge in the Industrial Revolution? Why did we throw it all out in the garbage heap? You know, what can that traditional knowledge tell us about the world today so that we can make a new future? There's so many themes here of beauty and wisdom. It's a bit overwhelming, I have to tell you, sometimes.
Well, I think these are ideas whose time I think has really come. And I think it has so many applications and so much promise.
I do too, and I'm getting older, and I hope I could get it out before I get 14 or something.
Well,
Um,
we'll keep irrigating your channels, Ed.
but we're getting people like you and teachers trained and people who can carry things on too.
Well,
Yeah.
very cool. Well, I think maybe let's leave it here for this week. And then next time, why don't we jump into points and see what the
All right.
Neijing has to say about that?
Another great ball of wax, ball of yard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
You will.
Take care.